Okay, as you probably realize, I'm not Todd, although Todd and I were joking that he could log in under my name and then we could have some fun with that, but we decided not to do that. What we're looking at today is Ignatius's epistle to the Ephesians. Ignatius is, of course, one of the apostolic fathers, that first generation of Christian leadership following the death of the apostles. He is traditionally purported to be a disciple of the Apostle John. He died in 108 BC. He was martyred, literally torn to pieces by wild beasts, again, according to church tradition. And these letters, there are seven authentic, what are generally consensus, the general consensus is that there are seven authentic letters that he wrote. This is one of them. And he is supposed to have written six of these, at least, while he was on the ship that was taking him to Rome for his martyrdom. And so assuming these things to be true, and I don't want to get into issues of church history, and there is some discussion in the history of the letters themselves as to the level of authenticity and that sort of thing. But assuming these things to be true, I think we can see some very interesting insights into this. But the main thing, of course, we want to do is to look at dig into the Greek and just have a look at the Greek, make some comparisons perhaps with what we see in the New Testament in terms of structure and syntax. There's some interesting aspects there as well. So he's basically writing approximately 50 years after what we assume to be the completion of most of the New Testament. He shows familiarity with the epistles of Paul, with John, and with the Gospels in general, the Synoptic Gospels in general, particularly the Gospel of Mark. And we might see a few of these associations even if, depending on how far we get in the text today. So any questions so far? Okay, what I'll do now is I would just like to read through this first section here, which is the introduction to the letter. And then we'll start pulling it apart. I'll ask for volunteers to read portions of it, and we'll discuss it from there. So looking at the text, Ignatius, ho kai theophoros, te eulogimene en megethe u patros pleurometi. Te pro orismene pro aionon enai diapantos es doxon paranomen atropon. Hinomene kai ek legmene in pathe alethino in telemeti to patros kai Jesu Christu tu theu hemo. Te ecclesia, te axio macaristo, use Epheso. Tes asias, plesa in Jesu Christo kai en amomo chara chare. And of course, he starts with his name. He starts with his identifier, as is common in ancient epistles. Of course, modern letter writing convention, you put the name at the end. The ancients didn't like that. They liked people to know right away who it was who was writing to them, so they start with the name. And you get to see some capitals there. You know, you learn your Greek alphabet, and the first thing you forget, because you rarely see them, is the capitals. But there it is, Ignatius. Now the next phrase, just again, standing in apposition to Ignatius. Would somebody like to just read that? Just the next phrase to the comma.
Ha kai theophoros.
Right. Hokai theophoros. All right, so you have the article there, ho, and kai. And what do we think theophoros means?
God-bearer or God-fearer, maybe?
Yeah, God-bearer is a little better. It's the phoros root. It actually exists as an independent word, meaning it can be translated something like freight or something carried. But in this context, it refers to bearing. It's related to the Greek verb pharaoh, which means to bear or carry. So theophoros is one who bears God or one who bears the name of God. And the article used here, relating it back specifically to Ignatius. All right, and Kai, how are we to translate Kai here?
Seems adverbial, so like an also?
Yeah, so Ignatius, also the God bearer. All right, so this was one of the names which he was known for. Of course, he was the Bishop of Antioch, and this is one of the names that he is specifically known for as kind of a nickname. It was probably given to him by other Christians at that time. All right, so our next phrase here. Okay, so and what case are all of those? Ignatius ho Theophoros.
Nominative?
Yes, they're all nominative case. Okay, so he's the subject of the letter. He's writing the letter, and eventually we hope to see some sort of verb which is related to that. All right, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that verb. It's going to be a while. All right, in terms of the word order of the text. Okay, good. So could somebody read the next phrase then, te through pleromati?
Te logimene in megethe theu patros pleromate.
Good. A couple of missed accents there, but that's okay. Generally where we see the accent, of course, in the text, that's where you want to hit the stress. So it'd be eu logimene and megethe theu patros pleromati. So that would be the way we would do the syntax. Of course, modern Greek, well, actually modern Greek does it as a stress accent as well. The vowels would sound quite differently. So looking at te eulogimene, what are we looking at there?
Dative.
It's a dative. We can tell that from the te. That's one of the great features of Greek is that it has a definite article. Mm-hmm. And whatever it modifies, even if you don't recognize the ending particularly, oh, well, that other thing's got to be a dative too. And about 95% of the time that formulation actually works. So
looks like it's from eulogeo, right? You blessed be. Oh.
Yeah. So that's from eulogeo, to bless. All right. Literally to from eu and logeo would be the root, logizo, logos, all of those related. And of course, one of the meanings of that word group is to regard. All right. So to regard well, to bless, to speak well of. Are sort of handy synonyms that we can use to remember how that word is to be defined. So it is dative case, and what is its usage here?
It's a verb and it's dative, so it's got to be a participle.
Yep. Okay, so we're looking at a participle here, and what's the gender of that participle?
Feminine?
Yes, because you've got the eta with the iota subscript there, and so that marks it out as dative. If it's a participle, and particularly if it has the article in this kind of context, there's a couple possibilities. It could be used as a substantive, or it could be modifying something. Do we see yet what it's modifying? Anything in the immediate context, it could be feminine dative singular. Is the right answer. Don't see anything in the immediate context. And in fact, it does modify something, but what it's modified is delayed quite a bit, which is a construction called, oops, get my right, hyperbaton, from the Greek balo, to throw, and huper, beyond. And the idea is that the two the modifier and what it modifies is for rhetorical purposes separated. All right, and what the effect is here that the te eulogimene, this modifier, it gives it a certain emphasis, and also we're going to see several more modifiers before we get there, before we get to the actual noun, which these modifiers modify. And it creates a kind of almost, not exactly tension, but anticipation. What's going to come along? One thing I always recommend, your beginning Greek teachers will often tell you, find the main verb, find the nominative subject, find the accusative direct object, kind of parse out where the prepositional phrases are and adverbs and see what they go with, sentence diagramming. Now, I have nothing against sentence diagramming, but of course that's not the way the ancients themselves read it. They read it a word at a time, or they heard it a word at a time, just as you're listening to my speech now a word at a time. And if I stop in the middle, you don't know what's coming next. You've got to wait. And so they would see this dative feminine singular, they would see the participle, and they would be looking for what's going to come next, knowing that it might be a while. And so that it's always a good idea. That's one of the reasons I advise students as well to read through entire sentences at a time. Read it out loud. Try to hear the relationships between the words. And then you're beginning to replicate the reading experience that an ancient reader would have had. So we've got to suspend what te eulogimene refers to at the moment. We'll get to it. The next phrase, en megethe theu. Anybody want to have a crack at what that is referring to? So what is en?
Our great God.
Okay. Looking at the form megethe. All right. Well, first of all, look at en. Let's answer that question first. What is en, and what is it doing here?
Preposition.
Right.
Okay, it's a preposition.
And it takes a dative.
Right. Okay. And so, what is most likely to follow a preposition?
An object.
An object. And that object can be what part of speech?
It could be accusative. It could really be any part of speech when you're following a preposition, but because this is in plus a dative, it would be an indirect object.
Well, we don't really call it an indirect object unless it's indirectly receiving the action of a verb, such as the verb give, for example. I give Ryan $100. Ryan, that's just an example. All right.
Sounds great.
I give Ryan $100. Ryan would be the indirect object in Greek, to riano, or something like that, right? But we speak of prepositions taking certain cases, and en always takes the dative case. All right, so it's the word following it is dative, but what I was getting at is part of speech.
Noun.
Noun, right. It can be followed by other kinds of substantives. It could be followed by a substantive adjective. It could be followed by a substantive participle. But most often it's going to be a noun or pronoun. And so it wouldn't be the great God. Megethos, which is a contract noun. Megethos, megethus ta would be the, if you look it up in the dictionary. So it's a third declension contract noun. So that's the dative ending there in begethe. So, but it is, as you correctly noted, I'm not sure who exactly said it, but the person who said it correctly noted, it's related to megas. Megas, megale, mega, right? Which means great or large. So if this is a noun, how would we understand it?
Greatness of God with the theu?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so ThU here, genitive case. So, so blessed in the greatness of God, patros.
Father.
Right. And so we have ThU patros, very common combination, God the Father. Notice though, interestingly enough, it's the whole phrase is anarthuous. Okay, so let's do a little. Well, I meant to just do patros. Use my eraser skill here. Ha, how's that look? All right, so. All right, and so this whole phrase here is anarthrous, which means what?
No article.
That's right, no article. All right, actually from the same Greek root, which means to join. All right, so anarthrous, the A is the alpha privative, it makes it negative, so without an article. And it's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Very often in the Greek New Testament, you will see the article with God. And so Hotheos simply means, so Os simply means God, right? It doesn't mean the God. Now, if it were a pagan piece of literature, if we were reading a Delphic hymn to Apollo or something like that, you would translate it the God, because of course they had in mind a multiplicity of gods, a plurality of gods. But in the New Testament, the articular God, right? The articular God specifically means God as in the one and only true God. And one of the interesting things is with Ignatius is that he plays around with that article quite a bit more, and he also leaves it out where the New Testament would put it in. And my point in making that is that you will find different authors have a different sense of the way in which certain things are done in the language. And Ignatius does not use the definite article in quite the same way as you see the New Testament authors doing. All right. No doubt, though, that he's referring to God the Father. And even though that article isn't there, we have to put it in English. It's required in English. We wouldn't say of God Father. It doesn't sound right. And the Greek doesn't imply it. The lack of the article does not always map to the lack of the article in English, and the presence of the article doesn't always map to the definite article in English. And that's an example of that right there.
It's interesting that he only does it one time in this whole chunk with Jesu Christu to ThU.
That's right.
But then even down further, he uses theos quite a few times, but it's often without the article.
Right. And that's a particular feature of his style. And to him, the anarthuous theos means the same thing as the articular theos did to the New Testament authors. So now I should be fair too to point out that in certain in the New Testament itself, the articular theos is most common in the nominative and accusative cases. Oftentimes in the oblique cases, particularly in the dative, all right, you want to say in God. You don't say en totheo, you say en theo, right? And so in those kinds of prepositional phrases and so forth, or instrumental dative, you will often find, and this is particularly true of the Apostle Paul, you will find him dropping the article in those cases. But in the nominative and the accusative cases, most common. So, but I would expect even a New Testament author here to have written theou tou patros rather than theou patros. So just to get the idea that, one of the things that makes reading different authors difficult is they will have a different sense of style. They'll be using the language in a somewhat different way than you expect from the authors you've already read. And that's something to be aware of. Okay, as we continue at our breakneck pace, pleromati. What is that?
Fullness.
Okay. And what case is pleromati?
Native.
I think dative.
Yes. Again, this is what we call a third declension noun, consonant noun, some grammars call it. And the nominative form would be pleroma, pleromatos, ta. Again, a neuter noun. And so we have the dative case there. And what's it doing in relationship to megethe? Yeah, what's it doing there with relationship to megethe? Any suggestions?
Function adjectively?
That is one very real possibility. And the construction, when you have two nouns which are functioning one in an adjectival relationship to another, is next I'll be typing Hebrew. All right, is a hendiadys. All right. Again, like a lot of these rhetorical terms, that comes from the Greek. Haste me a hen, you may recall, meaning one, so hen. Dia, through, and deuce there, the root for two. So 1 through 2. All right. And so if it functions as an adjective like that, how would we understand it in relationship to megethe? Any suggestions? I'm open to suggestions.
In greatness and fullness of God the Father?
Yes. All right. Even though there's no connective there, that's actually another way of understanding it, as actually two separate nouns that simply function in a coordinate sense. So in the greatness and fullness of God the Father. If it's understood as a hendiadys, then it would be something like in the great fullness of God the Father, or in the full greatness of God the Father. And I tend to see it that way. I think either way of viewing it doesn't really change the overall sense of the passage that much, but it does change the way it's nuanced. So, but I think my preference for it would be in the full greatness of God the Father. So nice little rhetorical construction here, which, by the way, shows that Ignatius probably had something, even though he writes his actual grammar and syntax is much closer to Koine than what would be considered literary Koine or Attic Greek, which was the favored literary language, of course, during that period. It shows he has a little bit of education, that he can come up with a literary construction like that.
That's an interesting prepositional phrase.
How so?
Just having the noun, then the genitive phrase with the oppositional noun, and then back to an adjectival modifying negative thing.
Right.
It's just I don't feel like I've seen lots of phrases like that in the New Testament. Prepositional phrases.
There, the memory of a specific example fails me. I think you can find some examples, or at least people argue that there are certain examples of hendiadys in the New Testament. One place to look for a lot of rhetorical features is in the book of Hebrews, for anybody who feels up to tackling that. And so you see, can mine it for that as well.
Oh yeah, I wasn't saying that there's not hendiasis as much as just like in a prepositional phrase with the genitive and appositional noun related to theou, and then comes the other noun for the hendiasis. Does that make sense syntactically?
Yes, it does. And another that brings to my mind as well, the placement of the genitive is kind of ambiguous here. Is it to be are the genitives to be taken with megethe, or are they to be taken with pleromati, right? And by putting them in the middle like this, it kind of gives you both options and suggests that it's an intentional ambiguity on the part of the writer. He's not making the distinction here. It's really to be taken with both nouns, which would strengthen the idea that it is in fact a hendiadys rather than two coordinate nouns.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, chugging along here, unless somebody has a question so far. Okay, our next phrase here from te through atrepton, if somebody wants to have a crack at reading that. Don't all speak up at once.
Te prorismene pra ionion enidea pontas es taxon para monon art at re abrepton thing.
Good try, atrepton, right?
Atrepton.
So, yeah, and you added an extra syllable in ionon, but that's all right. That means you love Greek so much you want to speak more of it, so you're adding syllables. That's a good thing. Okay, so te prorismene. That should look familiar because it's coordinate with te eulogemene, right? So what are we looking at?
We're looking at another dative participle.
Right, another dative feminine participle. And does anybody want to hazard what the lexical form of that participle would be?
Prohorizo.
Prohorizo is right. And what does that mean?
Predestined or mark out beforehand.
Yep. And of course, that's a good New Testament word. Where do we prominently see that word in the New Testament? Paul. And where?
Romans chapter 8.
What's that?
Romans chapter 8.
Okay, and where else?
Ephesians 1.
Ephesians chapter 1. All right. And of course, in a somewhat parallel context, so to speak. So that, again, this is Ignatius' epistle to the Ephesians, and we see what is a possible echo of Paul's epistle to the Ephesians here. All right, so we have our dative, our at this point unknown, still unknown, dative feminine indirect object, but modified by te prorismene, so predestined. Pro ionon. Now, what is that a reference to? Pro means what?
Before here, that's what I would think, before.
Yes, it means before. And iono?
Eternity?
Yeah, now, this is from, is related to ion,
Age.
Age, right. So this is the noun form. And so what actual form is this? Number, gender, and case.
That's
plural.
Yeah.
Masculine.
Yes. Plural, masculine. So it's ion, ionos, ho. That's correct. And number?
Plural.
Yes. So before ages, literally. So predestined before ages. Again, here's an example where we don't have the article in Greek, but where it sounds perfectly natural and correct to put it in English. So predestined before the ages. All right, then anai. What have we got there?
An infinitive.
An infinitive from what verb?
Me.
Amy.
Amy is correct. So predestined before the ages, anai, to be. All right. Now we have this interesting prepositional phrase here, diapantos. How are we going to understand that?
On account of? Or because of?
The accusative means on account of, but what case is pantos?
Oh, genitive. So through.
Right, so what does dia mean with the genitive?
Through.
Through. So diapantos, how are we going to translate that?
Through all things or through all places?
That would be diapanton, right? That would be the genitive plural, and we have the genitive singular here. All right. So we've got this prepositional phrase. All right. I don't know what good those little lines I drew good, but it kind of marks it off. Diapantos is actually a, it literally, just how would you translate it? Let's put it that way.
Through all?
Through all.
Right? And in fact, it's a fairly common phrase used adverbially, through all or always. All right? Some people say that they want to supply chronu with it, which would go...
For all time?
Yeah. So you put... let's see what way... Whoops. Forget the accent. So chronu, so through all time. But it can be understood even without that, just to mean continually. All right. So predestined before the ages to be through all or continually or through all time. Eis doxa. All right. So we've got another prepositional phrase there.
Into the glory or into the glory?
Yeah. Yeah, eis plus the accusative, of course. Eis has a variety of usages. When you're talking about an abstract noun, the most common translation for it would be something like for. So for the glory. Again, it sounds natural to put the article in English here because we simply would not have this phrase without the article in English. So for the glory, or do we need the article? For glory. Now, what are we doing with these guys here? All right. What are we doing with them? What are those? What parts of speech are they?
Adjectives?
They're adjectives. What do they modify?
I would guess glory or doxon.
Okay, doxon. Now, what number gendered case is doxon?
Accusative, singular.
Accusative singular and gender?
Feminine.
Feminine?
A couple of you at the same time, but I think I heard feminine come out of there.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we have these kind of funky endings here? Don't those look like accusative masculine singulars to you?
Mm-hmm.
So what's going on? How can it modify doxon there?
It actually is feminine.
Say it again?
It's one of those, it appears masculine, but it's actually feminine adjectives.
Yeah, what we call those is two-ending or two-termination adjectives. In other words, for those, if you look them up in the lexicon, right? Let's see. All right, so it'll show the ending something like, whoops. So os would be the ending for the would be the masculine and feminine, and on would be for the neuter. So remembering that adjectives are listed by their nominative singulars there. So these are actually feminine, all right? They look masculine, but because they're two termination adjectives, they use that one set of endings for the masculine and feminine, and then there's another set of endings for the just for the nominative and accusative singulars and plurals, which is a little bit different. All right, so both adjectives do in fact modify doxon. So we'll draw a little line to indicate that. What do these mean? Paramenon, atrepton. Neither of these are New Testament words, by the way. You will not find these in the New Testament. But from context, can we figure it out? So let's look at it. Foreordained, predestined, before the ages, to continually be, or to be through all time, for glory, glory which is paramenon.
Only belonging to him?
I like that. It happens to be wrong, but I like it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I saw the monon thing, and I was thinking of monos for only or one, but I didn't know how para is acting with it, and I didn't want to commit a pineapple fallacy.
Pineapple fallacy. I like that. Yeah. In this case, I'll just give it away. Paramenon means enduring, lasting. So you could translate it as for glory, for enduring glory. Now, atrepton is actually related to the Greek word trepo. Does anybody know what that means?
To put to shame.
Say it again.
To put to shame.
Okay, that's one possibility. It can also mean something like to turn or to change. It's also related to the noun tropos, which means
like a tropism.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so atrepton means, in this context, unturnable or unchangeable. So glory which is enduring and glory which is unchangeable. Okay, any questions or comments on any of this so far?
No, but that sounds like an allusion to James, where it talks about him having no shadow of turning.
Yes, it does sound like that. It doesn't use that word, but the concept is similar. And of course, that's one of the things we look for when we're looking for allusions or references that ancient authors have to one another. You know, they don't use modern quotation techniques. And so we look for similar vocabulary, but we also look for similar concepts. All right, I'm not sure that I would draw that concept with James here, but it is possible.
How often do you see prepositional phrases again with like this with two adjectives right in a row modifying the object?
Yeah, and that's another interesting point. There's no connective. Whoops. There's no connective between these two, right? And you would expect it to be there. You'd expect a chi to be there, right? I mean, that's how you would see that normally in Greek. You would see that normally in English as well. And when you don't have a connective where you would expect it, that's another literary device called,
Ascendanton.
Ascendanton, yeah. All right, which simply means a lack of connective. Another good Greek root there, as many of these are. So, yeah, that would be ascendanton.
How often is ascendanton happening on a word level? I thought it's normally clausal.
It can be done either way, actually. It's the simple definition of it is you expect a connective, you don't get it. when we do it in English, we will typically throw a comma in, and it has that same sort of effect. For enduring, comma, unchangeable glory, which rather closely connects the two concepts. Okay, let's move on to the next phrase then. Could I have, oh, this is a long one. Do I have somebody who would like to read that? Preferably somebody who hasn't yet read.
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
It's, many ke ekelegmeni and pati alisino and mati to patros ke isu Christu to theruimon.
Okay, very nice. A little bit more modern sounding pronunciation there. All right, let's look at that first word in this particular phrase, which I'll use more Erasmian pronunciation, henomene, henomene. Can we guess what word that is from?
I'm thinking gnosko, but that beginning with that rough breather, that's throwing me off.
Right. Okay. So you've got the rough breathing there. Let's take a step back and look at the form, henomene. Now, as a clue, we've had te eulogemene, te proorismene. So what most likely is henomene?
Another dative participle.
Another dative participle. Okay. And that being the case, I'm trying to think of the best way to get to this.
It's the eta is elongated, so it's from and the contract verb and no.
Okay, so yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, so you have an eta. Now, if you look it up, you will not find a word he no or henoo or heneo. All right, but if you look up under, let's see, oh, there it is. So we've got, back to my Greek here. You will find this root, hen, and in fact, you eventually find henoo. So what does the hen remind you of? That part of the root?
One,
exactly. And henoo, in fact, if you look it up, means to make one or to unite. All right? And so what would the, we talked about the tense or the aspect of the participle. What would that be here? So we got present participles, aorist participles. What would this be?
Aorist participle?
Nope, because aorist participles do not augment.
Perfect.
Say it again?
A perfect?
Yes, it's a perfect. All right. So one of the things that distinguishes the perfect is that it augments. You see an example of that in the next participle, ek lelegmene. All right, so you see the augment, not the augment, but the reduplication is what I meant to say. So it's from ek lego. So you get into the perfect stem and you have that augment. All right, you have the syllable I keep saying augment, please. I meant reduplication. All right, so you have the reduplication, which is the first syllable. Now, normally, if it's a consonant, it will reduplicate with the consonant, right, with the same consonant, and then it will add the epsilon, just, as a little vowel to put it in there. So, ek leleg mene, right? However, when you have a word which begins with a vowel, all right, he no. Let's see if I can put it up here. All right. So your reduplication would be something like oh, that's interesting. So what happens then is that you combine the reduplication and you get what is called in some grammar textbooks a spurious augment. All right, it looks like an augment, it's actually a reduplication. Originally, if you go back far enough in the language, you will find out that these would reduplicate with a consonant which has been lost in the language, the digamma, which was pronounced like a W. So it would have been wenoo, right? But that dropped out of the language, and instead you had what they call compensatory lengthening, and so you get that spurious augment. So when you have these perfects that begin with a vowel, you get the lengthening there. So, united. Kai ek lelegmene. So we have another perfect participle, already gave that one away, dative singular again. All right, and what does eklego mean?
Chosen.
Chosen, right. And I should point out that these are middle passive participles, right? You have the menos or the men root in here in both of these. So united and chosen, and pathe alethino. So we got another preposition, another prepositional phrase with en pathe. And what would pathos mean?
Suffering.
Suffering. It can also mean more generally feeling or something like that. Considering the context of this epistle, if what is true about Ignatius is what has been recorded, then suffering, I think, would make good sense here. So united and chosen in alethino suffering. Alethino.
Describing the suffering, so a genuine, true suffering.
Right, true suffering. So in true suffering, then we have another prepositional phrase here, enthalemity.
By the will, by the will.
So by the will or in the will, we don't make a huge distinction between those ideas in English. Either one, I think, would capture the sense of the Greek perfectly well. So in the will hupatros.
Of the Father.
Right, of the Father. And Jesu Christu Theou Hemon.
Jesus Christ, our God.
Christ, our God. Yeah.
Okay, and this is, of course, one of the major themes that we see in Ignatius's writings is Jesus Christ as God. And we have Jesu Christu followed by the articular ThM, which shows that he is particularly defining what Jesu Christu is. All right. He also uses tu patros. All right. And the effect of the article there and with ThM following Jesu Christu is also to distinguish the two. That, in other words, tu patros is different from Jesu Christu. They're not the same. All right, they're two separate persons, so to speak. And so in the will of the Father and of Jesus Christ, our God. And again, if we think about the context of this epistle, and particularly Ignatius' reported background, that he was a disciple of John, this gives us a clue as to how Ignatius would have understood John 1:1, right? Particularly John 1:1c, theos ein hologos, the Word was God. And for Ignatius, there's no ambiguity at all as to what that would mean. To Ignatius, Jesus Christ is properly referred to as God, and he does so a number of times throughout his epistle. So any further observations on the Greek of this passage so far?
Are both of those prepositional phrases modifying both of the participles?
I believe so, yes. So in true suffering, well, okay. Now that I'm looking at it, so united and chosen in true suffering, I think I would take the enthylemity adverbially with en pathe alethinon. So in other words, that the suffering is by the will of the Father and of Jesus Christ our God. So I think it would be a little better to take it that way. And would be kind of the natural progression of the discourse here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving on. Te ecclesia. All right, somebody want to read this last phrase for us? Again, somebody preferably who has not read before. Let's see, who hasn't read before? I haven't been keeping that close a track. All right, well, let me just do it then. So, te ecclesia, te axiomacharisto use Epheso tes Asias, plesta en Jesu Christo kai en amomo charachare. All right. So, te ecclesia, that's a word we should know. What is that?
To the church.
Right.
The church.
So we finally get the noun, which all these participles have been modified.
Yeah.
All right, so there it is. Again, what we said earlier, hyperbaton, it's far removed, but our sense of anticipation is rewarded as we get to that. So to the church, and the church here is described as te axio macharisto. Can we figure that word out?
Most happy, or
Okay, well, it consists of two roots, right? Yeah. Can you follow that line? That was pretty good. All right. It consists of two roots. All right. So the first root would be axios. And what would that mean?
Worthy.
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 And the second root, the most common form that you see in the New Testament,
Makarios.
makarios, right, which means?
Blessing.
Happy,
Blessing.
blessed.
So what? How would we understand the combination?
Worthy of blessing.
Blessing. So to the church, worthy of blessing, te axio makaristo. Notice the omega ending, modifying ecclesia. That's another one of those two termination adjectives, right? And notice te ecclesia, te axio makaristo. When you have the article with the noun and the article then repeated, does anybody know what that construction is? When you're talking about adjectives and participles.
Say
Say it again?
Is it a second attributive?
Yeah, attributed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
So it's
the
attributed.
yeah.
Okay, and then you have use. What is use from?
Amy?
Amy,
Amy.
Being.
And it is what?
Participle?
participle.
Right. So to the church worthy of blessing, literally being Epheso.
In Ephesus.
In Ephesus, right.
Ephesus.
This would be a locative dative, right? A dative of place. And then tes asias, the editor of this text thinks that that is probably a later edition in the manuscript edition, but if it's there, how would we translate it?
Of Asia.
Of Asia, right. So that's a genitive there. And of course, it also makes perfect sense if we leave it out. And then we're getting on to our time here, but this last phrase, plesta in Jesu Christo kai in, let's move over, in amomo hara kaire. All right, so this is actually the point, right? And so what is the key word here that we're looking for? You actually see this, speaking of James, you see this form in James in the greeting.
Kyrene?
Kyrene.
Yeah.
All right, and that's simply a kind of infinitive form that was typical in letters and used to mean greeting. All right, so the first word in this phrase, plesta. Anybody recognize that?
Polus.
Yeah, it's actually the superlative from polus. It's fairly frequent in greetings like this, actually. If you look particularly at the non-literary papyri, right, you'll see this form used fairly frequently. Plesta, it simply means very many, or we would just say many. As though it were the pola. You see both forms used, both the positive and the superlative forms used. So plesta kairein, many greetings, abundant greetings is probably the best way to translate that. And Jesu Christo?
In Jesus Christ.
Yes, in Jesus Christ. Kai and amomo kara.
That's from amormos, which is blameless.
Blameless, right. So, and in blameless joy, kara, or joy without defect, or full joy, you can possibly translate it. All right, so I think they allow us an hour time for these, right? So we're kind of at our time here. Did anybody have any other specific questions about this? That they want?
Did you see any significance in the tense forms, like that they go from perfect to aorist to perfect again, or is that just because of the lexical form of?
Well, it's a very good question, and it gets into what we call, now the majority of verb forms here are what? They're participles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact,
Sure.
we just read through a whole section of Greek that made perfect sense that did not have an indicative verb form.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's actually kind of understood in the whole thing. Kairein would sort of take its place. But this has to do with what we call accent. Aspect, not accent. Aspect of the participle. And unfortunately, we're kind of at the end of our time here, but maybe we can pick up with that next week when we get into the second part of the text. And maybe we could start with that.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
All right.
Thank you very much for introducing us to Ignatius. That's really helpful.
Okay, very
Yeah.
And we'll try, there's a number of interesting things in the second section as well, so we'll have a look at that next week.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it's really cool seeing Jesus as God, you know, that he clearly understood that.
Yep. And it's impossible to read this text any other way. And considering that he is a disciple of John, all right, this is how he is passing on that teaching that John had. So that's an early witness to the theology of Jesus Christ as God. Okay, guys, I'm going to shut us down now. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank
Take care,
you.
everyone.